Funding for the Agenda with Steve Paikin is provided by Ontario's 33,000 chartered accountants, public policy leader since 1879. More information is available at icao.on.ca. And by contributions to TVO by viewers like you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Steve Paikin here at Yonge and Eglinton in our Midtown Toronto studios here at TVO. Hoping you remember to set your clocks an hour ahead. We're just a little after 1:30 Eastern Daylight Time now. And we're going to talk about the future of horse racing for our online chat here for the next half an hour or more. Here in the province of Ontario, this has been one of the most difficult files on the Premier's and the Minister of Finance's desk over the last half year to a year or so. Has caused a lot of confrontation between the industry and the Government of Ontario. There may be a solution close. There was certainly an agreement signed by the Ontario government and the industry last week, and we're here today to discuss whether that in fact will save racing in the province of Ontario. We're joined via Skype from Hallandale, Florida by Dennis Mills. Mr. Mills, you will recognize as a former Liberal Member of Parliament. He's now the President and CEO of a group called Racing Future, which got together almost a year ago in an attempt to save this industry. And John Snobelen is here. You will recognize Mr. Snobelen as a former cabinet minister in the government of Mike Harris. He's also part of a 3-member horse racing industry transition panel, which was tasked by the current Liberal government to come up with some solutions for saving the industry as well. John Snobelen, welcome to you. And
hi.
Dennis Mills, nice to have you on the line from what looks like pretty sunny Florida. How is it down there?
It's great down here, and it's great to be on your show, John.
Good. Thank you for joining us today. Let's just start with some background for those who don't know this well. I want to take us back to the slots at the racetrack program. And John Snobelen, maybe you could start by telling us what that in fact was all about.
It started way back in about 1997, if I recall correctly. Mike Harris government, I had a little look at this from the cabinet table. You know, when the province was allowed to have control of slots, when the federal government downgraded that or allowed the provinces to be in control of it, I think every province looked at how to deal with it. The Harris government came to the conclusion that racetracks were the right place to host slots for a whole lot of reasons. Deal was struck where racetracks would and local host municipalities would share in the slot revenues. The exact split was 5% to municipalities, 10% to horsemen for purses and some track support, and 10% directly to the tracks.
And that worked out to what, about $345 million a year in Toronto?
Yeah, much to I think everyone's surprise. It grew to the point where it was $345 million a year going into the industry as of 2011. So it was tremendously successful from that point of view. But it caused some problems. The government of the day decided to cancel that a year ago.
We'll pick up on that. Dalton McGuinty decided to cancel this program. Why?
Well, there's lots of reasons why. There was a report done in 2008 by Sedinsky. A panel had a look and talked about some of the problems of the industry and some of the excesses that $345 million create, the lack of benchmarks for performance by the industry, all sorts of those indicators that should have been in the deal way back in 97 or 98, had by the time 2008 rolled around become pretty obscene in some cases. I mean, there's an awful lot of money going in the industry. So Sedinsky advised some things. That kind of sat in a shelf for 4 years. Drummond came along and said this needs to be reviewed. There's some problems with it. And post the Drummond report, the government decided to end the program.
Because they wanted that money for something else.
I would assume that the need and want for $345 million probably had a lot to do with that.
Okay. Dennis Mills, let me get you in at this point. And I need you, first of all, again, by way of background, to tell us, once the government announced it was canceling that partnership that you and the government had over the years, what was the impact of that cancellation on the horse racing industry?
Well, the impact was devastating right from the beginning because it came as a shock. But I do want to add one element to John's words to you and to our audience, and I respect the great work that he and the panel have done. But the focus is on the $345 million that came out of the 17 tracks around Ontario, but there's not enough emphasis on the $14 billion that the provincial treasury received over the 14 years. This is one of the most successful partnerships in the history of our province. And I salute the Harris government for founding it. But the way it was dismantled was very tough, devastating on the industry. Thank goodness the government, certain members in the cabinet, the government appointed the panel, and thank goodness Premier Wynne, after 15 days in the legislature, has created a pathway for renewal, and that's where I want to focus.
Can I get you, just before we focus on the renewal, to talk about a perception that media may have helped create, that certainly some politicians helped create, the notion that this relationship between the Government of Ontario and the horse racing industry was in fact a partnership as opposed to a subsidy, which a lot of people described it as such. What word better describes it?
Well, it is a partnership because in a partnership, everybody brings something to the table. And I would focus on Woodbine because most of your listeners and viewers would relate to Woodbine, not all the smaller facilities. Woodbine represents 60% of this total partnership. And Woodbine brought their brand, their infrastructure, their building, their washrooms, their parking lots, their location to the table. So, and their zoning, it was pre-zoned as a gaming site. So this was not a, if you wanted to use the word subsidy, you could say the province was subsidized by the fact that the $1 billion worth of infrastructure that Woodbine had was already in place. So the media and others have characterized this as a subsidy when in fact, in any business terms, and all your sponsors, the Chartered Accountants of Ontario would definitely define this as a partnership and not a subsidy because both parties brought something to the table.
Well, I should ask John Snobelen the same question. Partnership or subsidy? What better describes it?
You know, a lot of people have got hung up on what is really semantics in this. Look, in our report, we said there's one thing very clear around the world, in that horse racing requires some form of public assistance, whether that's access to some gaming revenues that are other than the parimutuel racing, you know, the Commission on Parimutuel Racing, whether it's a direct government injection of cash. The industry itself depends on that around the world, wherever it's robust. And so some measure of public support has to be in there.
But I notice you're kind of taking the fifth on what word you want to use to describe this relationship.
Well, you know, it's been a hot button word for people. Subsidy is a hot button word for people. I don't think it's worth pressing that button. The point is that there has to be access to some form of public help for horse racing, or it simply can't be robust and can't continue on in the future. We made that point clear in our report. The government's accepted that, and now they're on the way to building a new program.
So now we need to find out, just before we start taking questions from our online audience, Dennis Mills, there was an agreement signed between Premier Kathleen Wynne, in her capacity, funnily enough, not as the Premier, but in her capacity, I gather, as the Minister of Agriculture and Food, to come to a new agreement. Now, it's not $345 million, but tell us how much it is and whether you're satisfied with it.
Well, I think the biggest applause to the Premier and her team is the fact that after 15 days in the legislature, with the help of the panel, and I salute the panel, I can't say that enough, I'm totally on side with this, but the fact that she said that horse racing now will be part of the province's overall gaming strategy is a very solid commitment to stabilizing and revitalizing the horse racing industry in Ontario. Because in the past, OLG has essentially treated horse racing like an orphan, even though the biggest amount of money that comes into the treasury of OLG comes from horse racing in the partnership with slots. They have other instruments that they have failed to use to support. They have 12,000 distribution outlets. There's no reason why they couldn't use those 12,000 outlets to put a horse racing game in there so that any time anybody goes to their general store or buys a lottery ticket, they could have the choice or the option to buy the race of the week at Woodbine or Flamborough or wherever. So I think her commitment to integrate horse racing into the overall strategy of gaming is something to be applauded.
Okay, we have, I actually have more questions, but I'm going to hold off for now because I see people online who've dialed us up at theagenda.tvo.org have their questions for you too, and let's get to those now. Here's a guy named Pete, Mr. Snobelen, who says, would you care to explain to the people in this industry who are about to lose farms and slaughter horses exactly how your panel can support a decision by the Liberals to throw away $1.1 billion a year of their cut of the SARP, that's the slots at racetrack program, and essentially kill the standardbred industry.
Do you think that the gentleman has a point of view?
I think he has a point of view, and I suspect you disagree with it.
Well, you know, he has a point. I mean, certainly there's a big change coming for racing. It's going to be smaller, you know, and the squeeze is going to be there for some parts of the standardbred industry. There's no question about that. The government, where I think the thinking gets a little fuzzy is about governments and slot revenues. You know, OLG has entered into an agreement with all of the racetracks that are operating now on a rental basis, so the slots will continue to be at those racetracks. What's happened is the revenue doesn't flow directly back into the horse racing industry now. So
it goes to OLG.
It goes to OLG. So from the government's point of view, the revenue's likely enhanced a little. I mean, if you have a look at what was going into racing and what will be. So frankly, their $1 billion the province's $1 billion is really not at risk now. The question is, how do we put enough funds, enough assistance into the racing industry to keep it robust in the province, and that's a big challenge.
And Dennis Mills, I saw from your publicity campaign there are 55,000 people who make their living in this industry. Going forward, if it's going to be a smaller industry, how many do you suspect are going to have jobs in it?
Well, I don't accept this point, and many I agree with, but this one I don't accept, that the racing industry has to be smaller. I agree with the accountability. I agree with renewal and adding new features to bring a bigger fan base. But there's no reason why through this renewal, the business, to use John Snobelen's words, cannot become even more robust. So smaller doesn't sort of turn me on. But I think we've got a struggle to get to that point. I think as horse racing people, we've done a very poor job in communicating not only the number of jobs that are involved in this business, but the amount of money to the overall treasury, the spin-offs, direct and indirect. The Canadian auto workers are masters and do a great job of explaining what they contribute to the economy. If they're a 10 in explaining their contribution, we're less than 1, and we have to improve on that. But I think now that we've got some time and we've got a good working relationship with the panel, I'm confident that we can not only sustain but grow the industry, not only on the thoroughbred side, but the standardbred side as well.
Okay, here's a question from Christine. Mr. Snobelen, you first. This is a 3-year agreement they've signed. What does the 3-year agreement on the integration of horse racing with Ontario gaming mean for breeding farms of Ontario? Will there be a future?
Yeah, I think there's very clearly a future for breeding horses in Ontario. And you know, I mean, this is the home of Northern Dancer, the Armstrong brothers family's great standardbred contribution to the standardbred industry. And of course, all the great thoroughbreds like Northern Dancer that have come from here. So yeah, there's a future for it. I mean, the government announced, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, that they will support the horse improvement program to a level of $30 million a year. That means some direct government funds going into the base of breeding. Breeding is also supported by a forgiveness of tax on parimutuel wagering, and that will continue into the future. So there's funds there to help, and I think support a really vibrant horse breeding industry in Ontario. And I don't think there's any reason why we wouldn't want to have that. In fact, one of the great things about having a live racing product in Ontario is you get that breeding program, and that's where really a lot of those jobs are generated.
Dennis Mills, I've got a follow-up for you. Says many people breed horses.
Steve, could I just pick up on something John mentioned there, because it's very important?
Sure.
He mentioned Northern Dancer. We have horse racing is one of Canada's greatest exports. This year in the Kentucky Derby, which is the most watched sporting event in the world, 46 of the 50 favorites came from the pedigree of Northern Dancer. So not only on the breeding side do we have a global reach, but very few people realize that when you watch a horse race coming from Woodbine or Fort Erie or Flamborough, it goes into 1,000 outlets all over the world where people can bet at off-track betting places or other racetracks around the world. And this gives Ontario, Canada, a global presence in terms of promoting Ontario, etc. So I think John's point in touching on the Armstrong brothers, Northern Dancer, is a very solid point that we have to build on.
Okay, here's the follow-up. Mr. Snobelen, you first. Many people breed horses for 4 or 5 years down the road. The Premier stated on Friday that the current deals with the tracks would only be for 3-year periods. How do we instill confidence in our breeders and maintain our world-class breeding industry?
Yeah, tough question. You know, I've been breeding horses for about 40 years in Ontario, not race horses, but...
Whereabouts?
In Georgetown.
Okay.
So, you know, facing an international market, much like the racing market, and the problem is certainty. I mean, in some cases, you're trying to look at what a buyer will want 3 and 4 years down the road and you know, how the industry will go. It's tough. You know, it's always a tough business. The most a government can commit is really 3 years. I mean, that's the practical limit of a government being able to budget.
Well, practically, this government can't really offer anything more than, you know, 6 weeks.
Yeah, the certainty of the industry is really based on a couple of things. Goodwill between the government and the industry, and I think we're trying to build that. And an understanding, as Dennis said earlier, an understanding of an appreciation for the economic factors that the industry brings. So the better that's understood, the better the long-term stability of the industry. I think we right now have a government that's committed to that. I think the opposition parties are by the way, committed to it. So we need to lever the position we're in now. We need to put a solid foundation underneath the industry. And if I was a breeder, I'd be improving my brood mares and making sure I bred to the best stallions and looking forward to a future.
Dennis Mills, let me ask you the political question here, because of course you've made this agreement, you as a horse racing industry, with the current government of Ontario, but this is a minority parliament. There is a budget coming up. There's no guarantee that this government will survive this budget. You know, if you had to make a bet, you'd say they probably would, but you never know. Do you have an undertaking from the 2 other parties that if an election were to take place and if one of them were to win, they will honor this agreement?
Well, the New Democratic Party have made a categorical commitment, and they've actually asked questions in the House on this. They're the only other party, we haven't heard anything from Mr. Hudak and the Progressive Conservative Party yet, but the New Democratic Party have committed that they would even stall the decision that was taking until a full cost-benefit analysis has done. I have talked to several New Democrats, and 3 in particular have said to me, Dennis, this is the only time politically we ever have agreed with you. You know, but they are solid behind maintaining and growing the horse industry in Ontario. In terms of the Progressive Conservative Party, if you wanted me to be political, I don't think Mr. Hudak could win, never mind, certainly not a majority, but even a minority, unless he stood 4 square behind the horse industry. He hasn't stated clearly yet what his position is. He hasn't asked any questions in the House or said anything, but I'm quite confident there's a good chance he'd be supportive.
Well, let me ask the follow-up to you on that, John Snobelen, because obviously most of the seats where this is an issue are currently held by Conservative MPPs, so presumably they know that.
I think there's a number of Conservative MPPs who are very concerned about the file and who we've had a chance to talk to and brief on the subject. But what underlies that, you know me, I don't know much about the politics, but and Elmer Buchanan and John Wilkinson wouldn't lend much to that. But
they were the 2 other people on your panel.
On the panel, so we covered the spectrum and really covered this file for 21 years at the cabinet table between the 3 of us. So interesting history. But here's the bottom line. We have now got measures of the impact of the horse racing industry in Ontario that would make it difficult for a government to make an unwise choice on this file in the future, regardless of the political stripe. And I think that's what's really important.
So the deal's in, basically.
I think we've got. Now we haven't got the metrics that we'd like to have going forward, but we at least acknowledge that this industry does generate jobs, does generate economic churn, and that a public investment is necessary.
Dennis Mills, you're going to get this next question here.
I totally agree with John on that.
You agree with that? Okay. This question's from a guy named Gord, and I suspect you're not going to love it, so I'm going to send it to you first, Dennis Mills. The question is, in return for continued public support, shouldn't the governments insist that the horsemen develop a business plan current with the modern age? What's your view?
Well, I will tell you that I totally agree with the person that has asked that question. John mentioned in his opening remarks about the Sedinsky report and accountability. I am 4 square behind having a business plan with full, transparent disclosure and accountability. This was a great piece of public policy when it was announced 14 years ago by the Conservative government. No doubt about it. What happened is, over the years, the lack of accountability created legal leakage, and millions of dollars went out of the industry that should have stayed inside the industry. And this is where the government's decision to sort of do a total review of this business was correct. The way they did it, I think, was awful. But I think this particular person saying there must be a proper business plan is right on the money.
Okay, here's somebody named Adam who's got the next question. And if I can just ask the control room, it looks like you're obscuring the bottom half of the question, which makes it hard for me to read. Is there any way that you can lower? There we go. Perfect. Okay. From Adam to John Snobelen, please address what he says is your 180-degree reversal of opinion on the subject of the slots at Racetrack Partnership from last March to now. Is he right?
Well, as you know, I'm publicly out there on my feelings. I let my feelings be known early last year, particularly about the manner in which this program was canceled. I think it needed to be reviewed. We have a consensus opinion from the panel that SARP was bad public policy, needs to be replaced by something better. But the suddenness of this was difficult for an industry to respond to. And I think that's predicated on the government just didn't know what the impacts would be. I mean, the government had information, we now know, that suggested that the industry would be fine without this money, that it would carry on regardless. And of course, that was just bad information.
Who would have told them that? I mean, that pretty obviously wasn't the case.
Well, that's the analytics that they got. You know, they get that from the Ministry of Finance and from other people. And in fairness to them, I mean, not to apologize for that, I don't have to. But some of the information around this industry, the measures for this industry, the marks for this industry in terms of benchmarks of where they should perform, have just been badly done in Ontario. We recommended that OMAFRA, the Ministry of Agriculture, take on a responsibility for measuring the equine industry in the province as a whole, and the racehorse industry as part of that, so there'll be better measures of performance and better measures of success.
Dennis Mills, here's a question from someone named Sue. What does this all mean for the rest of racetracks that are for profit?
Well, it doesn't matter for profit or not for profit. It doesn't matter. Let's use Ford Motor Company, for example. If they're going to build a new paint plant at their factory in Oakville, and they're a for-profit corporation, and they come into the government, they have to present a business plan, and the business plan has to make sense for the province or the federal government to help fund that paint plant. Well, the same thing happens in the for-profit horse racing business. There has to be a business plan that shows that public monies or in the partnership or whatever are going for the public policy purpose, and that's for the sustainability and the growth of the business. And as far as I'm concerned, as that test is met, I don't think the for-profit racetrack should be treated any different than any other sector of the economy that gets support.
Okay, Mr. Snobelen, here's a question from someone named Robert. What's going to happen with the accumulated funds in each track's purse account?
Well, we are a long way in the weeds. We're having a talk. We've had some discussions with the Ontario Racing Commission over the course of the last couple of months on how to deal with what we call stranded funds, which are purse accounts that haven't been run out yet. So this is money that's withheld for horsemen and purses. Well, here's one thing that will happen. All of that money will go into purses. So the government's not going to repatriate any of that money. The government's not looking to take that money away from horsemen, but to ensure that it stays in purses. The question remains, though, what happens if a track chooses not to run, not to accept transition assistance for this year, and there's a stranded account of purse money there? We'll have to make an arrangement so that the horsemen in that area have particular access to those funds, because really it's their purses.
Okay, here's another question from someone named Samara. Why does the transition report barely touch the thoroughbred dates and cut standard bred in half? Seems odd, doesn't it? If they're planning on reducing the industry, why hit the one that everyday people are more involved in?
Well, you know, I mean, again, this is a heartfelt thing for lots of folks, and for years, thoroughbreds have been looked at as the sport of kings, and standardbreds really came from the farms and really came from county fairs in Ontario. I was part of, when I was a little guy, going to those county fairs and watching standardbreds. So I understand the evolution. Here's the problem: if we look at it in a global scale, most of the betting action is on thoroughbreds, and so they really drive a lot of the action. And the slots program, when we started using slot money to support purses, we ended up with a much larger pool of standardbred racing than the parimutuel commissions would sustain. So right-sizing that means that standardbred racing takes a bigger hit right in the middle of its industry than the thoroughbred business does, because that's the way horse players shake it out.
I suspect both of you are going to want to have a hit at this next question, which is from someone named Jason. Dennis Mills, let's go to you first on this one. Why is it that the more conservative community that makes up the horse racing community is arguing for major industry subsidies? Rural Ontario Conservatives are constantly attacking anything that remotely smells of taxpayer subsidy, regardless of the benefit to our greater economy. Dennis Mills, you went first at that?
Well, I don't notice that it is a conservative thing. I believe that rural Ontario is reviewed and looked at, whether it be dairy farming or chicken farming or, the horse business or whatever. All of these various sectors within agriculture are reviewed in a proper and a professional way, and they go through all the tests. And quite frankly, I think there are a lot of people in rural Ontario that are conservative because they're used to watching pennies, they're used to belt tightening, and sometimes they feel, because of the major markets in southern Ontario, like the big cities, that there's not enough of that. And it's just a total disconnect that we have to deal with.
John Snobelen?
Welcome to agriculture. I mean,
that's the way it is.
It is the way it is. And again, I think this is really important. Around the world, you won't find a vibrant horse racing sector without some form of public assistance. The question is, how do you benchmark that? How do you measure it? How big should the industry be? Those questions we addressed in our report.
Are you satisfied with the solution so far that the government has put forward?
Yeah, I think, we've had a very willing, and again, Dennis said this off the top, the Premier over the course of the last couple of weeks has grabbed the file, both in her capacity as Premier and her capacity as the Minister. The announcement that she made last week was spot on with what our report said. And so we are now moving as quickly as we can to finalize the arrangements so that we can get a healthy 2013 season under our belts. I also agree with Dennis from earlier. Our business really isn't just to stabilize the racing industry in Ontario, it's to grow it. And the way to grow that is to grow the fan base, to market the product properly around the world. Horse racing is a pretty exciting thing. I think we just need to let people know about it more.
Okay, here's a new question from Lori. Lori asks, it is now breeding season again, and breeders and investors need to know dollar amounts to keep their money in on breds. In Ontario breds. Ontario breds. Why are they not releasing more information? Because if they don't, it will be another breeding season damaged, and the OSS program, which was world-class, will become irreversible. Okay. Dennis Mills, you wanted that first? What's the OSS program, first of all?
Oh, this is an excellent question, because I am a breeder and I also race. And what the Ministry of Finance does not seem to understand at this point is the sense of urgency. People, if they don't feel the stability with the racetracks immediately, they will start shipping their broodmares to other states. And right now, as John has mentioned, we have competition from Maryland, we have competition from New York, we have competition in Ohio, where these states have now recognized the importance of their horse racing industry, and they've got massive partnership agreements. So we need to announce immediately from the finance these final deals that will show what the purses for racing will be like, because the purses affect the breeding. Because if I know I can buy a horse and it's got a good chance of running and making some money, then that affects the whole breeding cycle. So the next few days is so critical that finance get these deals locked down in order to stabilize breeding and the purchasing of horses for the long haul.
John Snobelen, would you agree this is something that cannot await the budget in a month or two?
Oh, absolutely not.
Got to happen now.
And it won't have to. The Sire Stakes program, it's a complicated program that helps breeders by putting special awards for Ontario bred horses. It's really key to having a successful breeding operation in Ontario. Listen, here's the problem. The panel said you have to have three things to have a successful racing program. You have to obviously have the horse persons, the people that make the industry work. You have to have breeders to create the horses, and you have to have tracks. And the province has gone about this, I think, the right way, the way we recommended it, which is get a deal with the tracks. Make sure you've got a place to have horse racing or none of it matters.
Well, actually, this next question relates to that.
We're well on our way to that, and we're also working on the breeding programs.
Okay, follow up here then, John Snobelen. This is a question from Simon. Why were the border tracks, Fort Erie, Windsor, and Sarnia, singled out and had their slots taken away? And why is Fort Erie not a gaming zone? Any thoughts on that?
Well, you know, this is Ontario Lottery and Gaming. I'm not a particularly good expert on OLG. I'm not sure I understood OLG in 1995. So that's their call, yeah.
Okay.
No, but hold it,
Go
Steve.
ahead, Dennis.
Let's deal, and I'll deal specifically with Fort Erie because you need a second thoroughbred track in Ontario, and Fort Erie must be that's the only choice that we have. And I believe when the Premier Wynne talks about integrating horse racing into an overall gaming strategy, I believe that a place like Fort Erie has to be really put in that sort of square and be reviewed. Unlike the decision that was taken in the past where essentially they stripped their slots away from them.
Well, Tim Hudak's from Fort Erie, Ontario. Do you think he's shown adequate sensitivity to what's going on there?
I would appeal humbly, respectfully to the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, first job at Fort Erie Racetrack and the Fort Erie Development Corporation, to please stand up in the legislature and please make his commitment to the sport. Because if this can be a file where everyone's unified, that would be a big step forward for the province.
Do you think Tim Hudak's been adequately sensitive to what's going on in Fort Erie?
I think Tim's pretty aware of what's going on with the track, and you know, he's kept an eye on this file. So you know, I won't give him recommendations on what he should or shouldn't do in the legislature, but he's certainly up on it. Look, Fort Erie's, I think, 115 years old. It's part of the history and the fabric of Ontario. Nobody wants to see that track go away, but it's had serious financial problems that were not related to SARP even, going back a decade or so. Right now, they're in negotiations with the province for some assistance in making a transition to the 13 and 14 years. I hope that gets done because I think that circuit of thoroughbred racing is important to racing in Ontario. But you know, those things are in conversation right now. There has to be a deal that meets the public test.
Here's a question from Warren. Mr. Snobelen, thank you for your dedication to the industry. What is the likelihood of off-track betting being opened up to more outlets, such as bars and restaurants similar to the tab system in Australia? And maybe as you answer, you could tell us what the tab system is to
well,
begin
we've
with.
seen Australia does a great job of supporting a racing industry. I mean, there's I think a racetrack every place there's more than 5 people. But they literally have hundreds of tracks, and they have a very aggressive way of marketing their product in the world, which, you know, we can emulate. The question about having more opportunities is one that Dennis addressed earlier on. You know, we have OLG with a lot of outlets, and if we could have horse racing, people have access to horse racing through more venues, then perhaps we'd be all right. One of the things that's happened, though, over the course of the last few years is there's more wagering virtually. There's more wagering online, if you will, than physically. So there's a combination of those two things. We're working with experts in the industry to work on what is the right combination of on-track, off-track, and virtual wagering. And you know, there's people who, we think we can present the product better. We think Ontario can do better in the marketplace if we do a better job of presenting it, especially outside of the province.
I've never ever said this before, but we have Zbigniew Brzezinski, Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, standing by to do an interview with us for the agenda. So we've got time for one last question. And this one's from Brad, and we'll have both of you gentlemen speak to it if you would. Tracks such as Georgian make the vast majority of their revenue from slots. With the new lease agreements, that will probably continue to be the case. What incentives will be offered to tracks such as Georgian to continue racing? Dennis Mills, you first.
I would throw that over to John.
John Snobelen?
Well, you know, in the long run, you know, we talked about not-for-profit and for-profit tracks. Georgia's a for-profit track. The owners of that track, Great Canadian Gaming, we're in discussions with them right now. They accept the fact that during this transition period, for a couple of years, we're going to have to put as much money as we can into purses and stimulate activity, and so there's not going to be a lot there for profit. They accept that. They're in conversations right now with the government about a transition fund to keep that racing facility open, particularly in the summertime when it's really vibrant. So those agreements will be made. I mean, the incentives will have to be wired in terms of the more and the better we do at presenting an Ontario product to the world, and the more revenue we receive from that, then everyone involved is going to have to participate.
And Dennis Mills, let me ask you one last question, which is, for much of the past year, the Ontario Liberal government seemed adamant about not doing what it in fact has done. And I wonder if you could tell us what you think has changed their minds, and if I can mix metaphors here, made them decide that they better play ball with you guys after all.
Well, I credit certain people within the previous administration that realized after the decision was taken that the panel needed to be appointed and the whole system needed to be reviewed. That's point number one. And as that panel and its knowledge and its recommendations grew, and then we were thrown into a leadership race, it was interesting how 6 of the 7 candidates all picked up on this and all committed on camera to really roll up their sleeves and listen and understand and promote the sustainability of the sport. And we're all of us who have invested in the game now and who believe in the game are pretty happy that 6 of those 7 candidates, including the Premier, are all in the cabinet.
Although Sandra Pupatello was the one who did not. Do you have any idea why she didn't?
Well, I think that it's not that she was really, she was knowledgeable about the game. I mean, coming from Windsor, she had a track. And I mean, of course, Dwight Duncan was from Windsor, and he led the charge in making this decision along with OLG. And I just don't know why her commitment could not have been more forceful. It's a mystery.
Okay. I want to thank both of you gentlemen for taking so much time with us this afternoon to answer our viewers' questions and mine as well. In Hallandale, Florida, where we wish him continued good weather and good fortune at the track. There's Dennis Mills, the president CEO of Racing Future, and John Snobelen, one of 3 former politicians who was on the horse racing industry transition panel. My thanks to both of you for coming in today.
Thanks, enjoyed it.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
And of course, I'm Steve Paikin. And we invite you to join us tonight on TV at 8 and 11 p.m. for another edition of The Agenda, and probably 2 weeks today, where we'll do another Ontario politics chat online on our website, theagenda.tvo.org. So long.
Funding for The Agenda with Steve Paikin is provided by Ontario's 33,000 chartered accountants, public policy leaders since 1879. More information is available at icao.on.ca. And by contributions to TVO by viewers like you. Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.